Welcome to Colonial Outcasts, where we analyze and comment on the decline of empire and the implosion of the rules-based order in real time. There is an apocryphal curse that goes something like this: "May you live in interesting times." And you know what? It looks like we've all been hexed because things are very interesting in a miserable, depressing, and horrifying way. Yay, world! Also, real quick, we are after that solid pitch, we are on Patreon if you want exclusive content. I'm going to be doing a video on the absurd media push to imply that Iran was somehow responsible for the attack on the person of Donald J. Trump last weekend. So if you want some commentary on the circus that is our government and media complex, there's that. If not, you can just like, share, and subscribe and turn on notifications, but only if you want to. So, anyways, we don't really release episodes on the weekends because of the bad engagement generally, but we're going to go ahead anyways in order to beat the news cycle because no one has yet given this Israel ICJ World Court opinion that dropped Friday the attention it deserves. Like, if anything is going to eventually cause a civil war in Israel in the future, I think it starts here. So today it's me, Greg Stoker, and Alina Xenofontos, and we're going to be chatting about how the rules-based order is about to blow. So, Alina, would I be correct in saying that when we use dramatic language like about to blow, we don't mean immediately? Like, these things take years.
Yeah, it could. I mean, to be honest, though, at this point, I don't even think it will take that many years because things are moving at such a fast pace. I mean, the kind of results that we're seeing, even with the ICJ rulings that we're going to discuss, they're quite monumental. And to a certain extent, I think the ICJ went even, beyond what was to be expected. So, given the sort of the escalation of events that are happening in Gaza and throughout Palestine at the moment, and the general geopolitical scene, we could be seeing results coming out of these ICJ rulings much sooner than we actually think.
Right. And so to that end, we're gonna just jump right in. I'm gonna play some. Yeah, we're all sick. We got allergies. I got COVID at a stolen land protest. So there may be some like coughs and sniffles on the audio track. But just bear in mind, like, we're doing the best we can, man. But anyways, yes, we're gonna jump right in. I'm gonna play some B-roll from West Bank. So if you're watching the video version, you're just not stuck with me doing straight up exposition for the next 3 minutes as we set the stage for this significant development in international politics. So, what happened on Friday? Well, the ICJ ruling confirms what Palestinians have been saying for 57 years. Israel's occupation of Palestine, the Palestinian territories, is illegal, a form of apartheid, and must end, says the UN's High Court at The Hague. The International Court of Justice advisory opinion on Friday also called for reparations for Palestinians, and this is the big point we're going to focus on, who have lived under Israel's occupation since it began in 1967, an unprecedented step for the court. The court also notably declared Israel's mistreatment of Palestinians to be a form of segregation and apartheid. It further ruled that nations cannot offer aid in support of the illegal occupation without violating international law, and upheld the Palestinians' right to self-determination. So sending aid to enforce and aid the occupation is a violation of international law. So when we give Ben Gvir a bunch of AR-15 assault rifles from old military stockpiles, that is now a violation of international law. So while this is hopeful, bear in mind that the ruling does little to immediately change the lived reality of Palestinians. So, amid the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, Israel began its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and annexed East Jerusalem. Soon after, Israel began to establish settlements inside the occupied territories, supporting Israeli civilians as they built communities atop land taken from displaced Palestinians. While Israel withdrew its troops and settlements from Gaza in 2005, which they love to bring up, it continued to promote and expand its settlements in West Bank. And in recent months, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's far-right government has used this war in Gaza as a cover to expand its settlements at a rate faster than previous decades. So the Israeli government immediately dismissed the ICJ ruling on Friday, as it has done with any other legal ruling against it, with a defiant Netanyahu calling Jerusalem, quote, our eternal capital, unquote, and referred to the West Bank as the land of our ancestors, using the biblical names Judea and Samaria. And I will read some of the response from the Israeli Foreign Ministry. So this was on their Twitter account. I'm going to take a few excerpts because it's exactly what you'd expect. And then we're going to spend the first 30 minutes of this episode breaking down 6 points about how everything that's said in this statement from the Israeli Foreign Ministry is absolute nonsense. So, first of all, before this episode, I consulted with like 4 different IHL lawyers, and we're just really surprised by the unanimity and the agreement of the humanitarian law community about what this means going forward. So, here we go. This is what the Israeli Foreign Ministry has said. Quote, unfortunately, the court's opinion is fundamentally wrong. It mixes politics and law. It injects the politics of the corridors of the UN in New York into the courtrooms of the ICJ in The Hague. The opinion is completely detached from the reality of the Middle East, while Hamas, Iran, and other terrorist elements are attacking Israel from 7 fronts. First of all, as you can tell, like, what does this have to do with occupation since 1967? Well, we're going to get into it, including from Gaza and Judea and Samaria, with the aim of obliterating it. And in the aftermath of the greatest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, the opinion ignores the atrocities that took place on October 7th. Keep that in mind, as well as the security imperative of Israel to defend its territory and its civilians. So we're also going to talk about Israel's right to defend itself. So the opinion only distances the possibility of resolving the conflict, says the Israeli Foreign Ministry. The Palestinian Authority, which initiated the move, is not interested in peace, but in slinging mud at Israel. Peace can only be achieved through direct negotiations between parties, and the Palestinian Authority will not be able to evade this reality by turning to international tribunals. Yeah, so they don't want any outside interference in their ongoing occupation. So that's all I'm going to read. It's hard to read, and you don't need to know anymore. Every talking point you've heard since October 7th is voiced in this opinion. So let's break. I'm going to take this down. Let's break this down point by point. So first, I would like to say, like, even a 10-year-old sees that what they claim and refer to is only politics. Like, they're only talking about politics. What they have said has nothing to do with the law. So that's why they aren't quoting anything. They're not quoting any legal precedents. They're not quoting any articles, and are only referring to their boring, same old arguments. I assume you agree with that.
Oh yeah, I just want to add one small thing, just a smaller sentence. They're also referencing the Bible, and I mean, really, like religious rhetoric in a legal ruling, which is absolutely ridiculous. Like, any court will tell you we're not concerned with any external political, mythological, religious ideas. This is strictly rules-based evaluation, but they'll bring in every piece of sentimentality possible, whether it's politics or religion, in order to sort of back up their claims, which I just think is absolutely ridiculous in 2024. But here we are.
Yeah, so it's almost like this press statement put out by the foreign ministry is not meant for anybody but like the religious Zionists living in Israel. Like, it seems like all like this statement is inward facing towards its, like, it meant to be only absorbed in some ways by its own population.
It's sentimentality at its best. That's why they also reference, the Holocaust and obviously the atrocities of World War II, which we all acknowledge, but have absolutely nothing to do with the current situation that's breaking out in occupied Palestine. But they will reference that in order to gaslight and appeal to the sentimentality, not just only of Israelis, but of all their sort of supporters, let's just say globally. And I find it to be very unethical, to say the least.
Yeah, so let's hear a statement from Nawaf Salam, the International Court of Justice president, so you can get some wording of the actual opinion in real time.
From the evidence presented to it, and on the basis of its analysis, that a broad array of legislation adopted and measures taken by Israel in its capacity as an occupying power treat Palestinians differently on grounds specified by international law. The court notes that this differentiation of treatment cannot be justified with reference to reasonable and objective criteria nor to a legitimate public aim. Accordingly, the court is of the view that the regime of comprehensive restrictions imposed by Israel on Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory constitutes systematic discrimination based on inter alia, race, religion, or ethnic origin in violation of Article 2, Paragraph 1 and 26 of the ICCPR, Article 2, Paragraph 2 of the ICESCR, and Article 2 of CERT.
So what we're seeing here is he's referencing actual legal, like codified legal precedents and articles. And so what their big thing has been is this, their main complaint has been this opinion ignores October 7th. And of course you can expand on this, but well, of course it does. This is what like all the IHL lawyers who wrote me back said, and it has to ignore October 7th because before they can rule on anything after October 7th, they need to set the tone on what laws apply, whether it's NIAC, non-international armed conflict, or IAC, international armed conflict, and when and where human rights law applies. So yes, it needs to know what the legal status of things were before October 7th. This isn't political or biased. This is just how any legal case needs to start with the applicable law. So, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So before we get into that, I just also want to say that the ICJ was actually called by the United Nations General Assembly in order to answer one fundamental question as well. And the fundamental question was, and I'm reading directly, is does Israel's occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem constitute as temporary or permanent, meaning full annexation, right? And this is going to be significant with regards to October 7th as well, specifically, because by establishing the parameters, as in what is the current status of Gaza as well. If Gaza is an occupied territory, if it constitutes occupied territory, then Israel no longer legitimately has a right to Article 51 as well, which is the article for the right to defend themselves or the right to self-defense, because that is exclusive to an interstate conflict, which is what we mean by international two different state actors. So it's very important, especially in the context of October 7th, to have an understanding as to what the situation, what the legal parameters are within Israel and Palestine. And therefore establishing, and the fact that the ICJ has now basically formalized officially that East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, and that's I think even most significant, are constituted as illegally occupied territories, means that the events on October 7th will now be viewed as not two interstate conflicts from occurring, but rather an internal conflict that is occurring within Israel, because Gaza is occupied territory that now constitutes effectively as part of Israel. And that is very significant, like I said, with regards to discussing Article 51, discussing Israel's right to defend itself, but also Israel's obligation under international humanitarian rights law towards the population that it is actually obviously occupying, because they do have certain obligations under international humanitarian law to protect the civilian population that they are occupying. And then obviously you have to get into occupation law as well, which is an entire other different ballgame. But then on top of that, then it also gets into another field, and that is if Gaza is therefore occupied territory, and of course the West Bank and East Jerusalem, then we also have to discuss the right of the Palestinians, which is the right to resist, which is also enshrined in international law as well, which therefore, again, will define rather significantly now the legal and political even discussions around the events of October 7th.
Right. And so just I don't really I have no formal experience in law. So just off the bat, though, it seems like they're kind of in this a little bit of a legal and rhetorical predicament where if they want to say it's an international armed conflict between state actors, which they would have a right to defend themselves, they would have to, in order for that to actually still hold true, in order for them to not be an occupying force, they would per force have to admit that Palestine is a state actor, which they don't want to do. So, like, how do they extricate them from that little pretzel? I don't.
They don't. This is the rationality and the lack of like the sort of the non sequitur way of thinking and the arguments made by Israel. So on the one hand, they argue that Palestinians don't exist, that Palestine isn't a state, that Palestinian statehood, if it ever is to exist, will only materialize through negotiations. So it technically doesn't exist, and therefore that's actually one of the reasons why they say that the ICC has no jurisdiction supposedly over Palestine, because Palestine doesn't exist as a state, even though obviously the Palestinian Authority had officially was appealed to the ICC and was recognized by the ICC. But again, Israel's come to say, well, Palestine doesn't exist as a state and therefore cannot be part and parcel of the ICC in any way, shape, or form. But then when it comes to the ICJ, or even when it comes to the October 7th retaliatory attacks and issuing Article 51 in order to defend themselves against what should be another state, they're basically viewing Gaza as an independent state, or rather they're saying it's Hamas ruled and therefore it's a separate entity. They're really, legalistically, really just playing on just semantics of, well, they're not an official state to therefore be recognized by the ICC, but they have, well, we're not completely occupying them because we withdrew our military forces in 2005 and Hamas has been ruling. So they're not an official state, but they're governed under another authority. And they're sort of playing on these non-existent sort of legalities, to be honest with you, so that they can abuse laws in whatever way that they want, essentially serving their own self-interest. So that's kind of, and hopefully I've summarized it in a digestible way. They're just, when it comes to Gaza specifically, they rule Gaza as not being occupied, which has been their main argument. That's not occupied territory. It's because they removed their military, completely negating the fact that even Israeli high courts consider the law of effective control to constitute as occupation, which we also saw the ICJ ruling reaffirm that occupation does not need to necessarily be a strict military presence within a territory, but it has to constitute as effective control over that territory. Even Israeli courts have recognized that. But then because Hamas has supposedly governance or some sort of authority over Gaza, even though actually they have no control over Gaza for the most part, that constitutes Hamas as an independent state. It doesn't make any sense. This is what people have to understand. The Israeli arguments never are constructive. They're constantly antithesis with each other. It doesn't make any sense. It's just purely political sentimentality, and they're abusing laws in whatever way serves them whenever they want.
Yeah, and you know, there's a reason Western media doesn't focus on what the main policy makers in Israel say, because not only is their foreign ministry just shilling out obfuscating propaganda. Let's look at one of the far right members who is a massive power broker within the government. What did he just recently say? This is in Hebrew, so I am going to read it out for the audio audience. So this is Ben Gvir speaking at the Knesset very recently, shortly before the ruling. So he says a Palestinian state cannot be established because there is no such thing as a Palestinian people. We need to start from the roots. Historically, there were no such people. Legally, internationally, there are no such people. There are, in the definitions of international law, 5 parameters that define a people. So he says that there are 5 parameters in international law that define a people. This is insane because he brings in kingship. Let's go. Language, currency, a king, a ruler. I always ask, okay, that was 4 things, right? That wasn't even 5 things. So I always ask who was the first Palestinian king. Heritage, history. There never was any. We must tell the truth, you know, sometimes. The truth is worth telling. The Palestinian national movement was established by al-Mufti as a counter-movement to the Zionist movement. There were Arabs as all the Arabs. There are many Arabs around us, Muslims, non-Muslims. They immigrated to the land of Israel. Okay, so anyways, I can my threshold for listening to Smotrich is very low.
Yeah.
So yes, that's his foreign minister who has a huge support base in Israel is saying international law. There are 5 things that establish a people, like language, currency, a
That's not
ruler, and a
international law.
king. Yeah, I know. So
That's not international law. They just manufacture whatever it is that they want. They bring up outdated concepts from the Middle Ages, which is obviously, when you can sit down to consider the fact that the state of Israel was established on some, biblical context in order to justify the existence of colonial state. It really tells you all you need to know. This is just historical revisionism, as per always, and constantly denial of Palestinian history, identity, and culture. I mean,
yeah.
That's all they have. They don't have any sort of legality in anything they say. So this is nothing that he said there was in any way defined in international. There must be a king,
right? And so this brings us. I think that's a nice segue into our third point. So we talked about how their response has had nothing to do with law; it's only politics. Their opinion, the opinion ignores October 7th because they're establishing a history of apartheid and occupation, which came before October 7th. And this brings us to the third point: Israel and its independent, functional legal system. Here they are writing about the ICC case. If the judges don't dismiss the case by the prosecutor, which they won't. The case by the prosecutor, it means that they've decided that there isn't a functional legal system and that the ICC found that it's not independent and can't investigate itself, and that alone would be catastrophic.
Exactly. And it even the apartheid, even the fact that the ICJ, not the ICC, even the fact that the ICJ, no, I made the mistake. Even though the ICJ has now just ruled essentially that the legislative and administrative systems in Israel have been established to purposefully discriminate against the Palestinians based on ethnic, religion, etc., identity, which is basically the definition for an apartheid system. This is historical because now you have the ICJ effectively ruling that there is officially an apartheid system of discrimination, which by nature is by default rather is illegal. And in doing so, the very fact that this is the Israeli legislative and administrative systems are imposing this illegal system of apartheid has completely delegitimized Israel legislative from the root. And this is going to be very important going forward with the ICC trials. It's also going to expand now the scope by which the ICC can also issue arrest warrants for other individuals within Israel for not just the propagation of occupation, but also the creation and the establishment, also the maintenance of an apartheid system. But most significantly, especially when it comes to the so-called internal investigations that Israel's always told that they have to conduct for their crimes against Palestinians in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and in Gaza, especially when you have the United States and you've got Matt Miller always coming out and making statements like, yes, we've asked Israel to investigate its own criminal actions. But we now have an ICJ ruling that is essentially stating that by default, the very basis of the legislative system governing the Palestinian people has been structured on illegality, and that is to sustain apartheid. That is illegal. So how can we now expect this illegal entity that is Israel at this point to in any way independently investigate itself and apply a rule of law when the very system itself is illegitimate? So it's a very significant moment, I think, this ruling, and it's going to extend to the ICC warrants, but also it's really going to bring to question the entirely, legal foundations and the administrative institutions of Israel. And this is going to be very interesting to observe how Western governments are also going to respond to this.
Yeah, I just I think one of the significant takeaways is just to break it down to the most simple terms, so people can have discussions about it with people who aren't amongst people who aren't legal experts. It's okay, because this legal system is an apartheid system that discriminates, that is built directly to discriminate against Palestinians. They cannot investigate their own crimes against Palestinians, and this brings their entire legal framework into question in terms of international law and the world court, and that is catastrophic for Israel.
Absolutely, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. So that's a pretty big deal. Like, they cannot investigate themselves. So I just want to see, like, now that there's a precedent, the World Court has just ruled that they cannot effectually investigate themselves. I just want to see Matt Miller squirm at the White House press briefing, be like, well, you know, we don't know. Like, they're investigating themselves. And then the journalist's reply will be, well, you know, the World Court just ruled that they cannot investigate themselves. Can't wait.
Exactly. This is going to really, that's what I found most fascinating as well about this particular ruling. It's not just applying huge levels of pressure at this point, although it's non-binding. It's not just applying political pressure and legalistic pressure on Israel, but it's applying it on the Western governments that have essentially been aiding and abetting Israel's colonial and criminal nature and apartheid system for as long as they have. And even with regards to Gaza. And I think it's also worth noting that the ICJ ruling with regards to Gaza being officially now declared as occupied territories within Israel is also going to extend to, like I said, their military presence in Gaza, as well as the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which we can obviously discuss later on in the podcast.
Right. And so this brings us to the next point that they made, that the Palestinians from the inception of Israel never wanted peace. They bring in al-Mufti and his movement as a reaction, as a counter-Zionist movement back at the start. And it's kind of just like blah, blah, blah. But the Palestinians did this and never wanted peace. It's like, okay, seeing that in their statement, they said they value international law and work to uphold international law. Well, if the Palestinians then were such bad, naughty boys, then why didn't Israel go to the Hague and open a case against them? Scared much?
Look, this is a really redundant statement to make, because if we look at the Oslo Accords, right, of 1993, the Oslo Accords were made sort of, the conditions were, and this goes back to the resolution, oh God, I can't remember, I think it was resolution 247. Please don't quote me. I might be wrong. I might have the numbers jumbled in my head. The main resolution with regards to the occupied Palestinian territories in 1968. And what it had said was, and this has been set as international law, that if the Palestinians were to recognize Israel's right to exist, this would sort of trigger a pathway towards the end of the occupation gradually and the existence or the creation of a Palestinian state. And then fast forward into 1993, the establishment of the Oslo Accords, and at the time, the leader, which was of the PLO, which was obviously Yasser Arafat, and it was at the time when PLO now was removed as a terrorist organization and basically acknowledged as the sort of leading authority of Palestinians. Yasser Arafat had recognized Israel's right to exist as a pretext to begin negotiations in order to establish gradually, supposedly over the years, Palestinian statehood. Yet it was Israel. So Palestinians have actually recognized and taken Israel and taken the steps necessary in order to essentially continue with the negotiations and to finalize a decision where both basically states can live side by side. And it's been Israel up until this point that has never recognized Palestine's right to exist, has never recognized Palestinians even as a people. And this has basically been a modus operandi for Israel as a state continuously up until this day. And then, without wanting to sort of get into all the history with regards to the supposedly Bill Clinton offer as well. Again, we saw the Palestinians willing to make a lot of concessions, but this is exactly why Israel would never actually take a case like this to the court, because you have so much fact-based evidence, essentially, to prove that the Palestinians have gone above and beyond to try to negotiate a deal or come to a settlement with Israel to end the occupation. And it's Israel that is consistently the one that is an obstacle. And last point, I mean, we also have leaked footage and documents of Netanyahu quite honestly stating he wanted to end the Oslo Accords. And throughout much of his presidential campaigns over the years, he said, vote for my party. We're going to prevent a Palestinian state from existing. And this has gone on record, and it's not something that they've been hiding. So this is why, I mean, they don't really have a claim to anything that they're saying, and blaming the Palestinians is cold, narcissistic gaslighting to victim blame and delude the public that may not know the history.
Well, you know, I do think there's some poetic justice here, in that Netanyahu has always striven to end the Oslo Accord. It has been, as you said, one of his massive campaign points, and now this ruling came through, and it effectively ends the Oslo Accords, but not necessarily in the way that Israel wanted it to be ended.
This is what happens when you overplay your political impunity, because now essentially what's happened is that you have the ICJ ruling that East Jerusalem, like we said, the West Bank and Gaza are officially illegally occupied by Israel. And the ICJ effectively ordered that Israel must immediately end its occupation. This means that the end of the occupation is no longer contingent to Israel and Palestine reaching some sort of settlement, which means that they both have to negotiate and find a resolution. This means that no matter what Palestine or Israel's relationship is irrelevant. Israel has to end the occupation, and that is it. And a Palestinian state will have to be established, and Israel has effectively no say. And this is going to be very significant again, because it destroyed the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords now have, or Oslo Accords type agreements will no longer be legally plausible, because the ICJ effectively saying, no more negotiations. You just have to basically end the occupation, remove all the settlers as well, destroy the wall that was established, all the walls that were established in the West Bank, basically completely removing themselves from these territories. And this is going to be interesting, because you've got the United States and you've got obviously the leaders of the UK and the general Western establishment, who up until this point have even refused to give Palestinian recognition as a state. And one of the reasons they refuse to do that is because they argue there needs to be first a negotiated settlement by which Israel has to accept to end the occupation of Palestine, therefore placing all the burden, all the power and the power essentially on Israel, that Palestinians can only gain statehood under the conditions set to them by their occupier. I mean, it's completely unethical. And obviously the international community, through multiple United Nations general resolutions, have always stood against this. But to now have the ICJ officially make this statement, this is the World Court, has really been a huge slap in the face for Israel, but including Western governments as well. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. So no more Oslo Accords, no more, we have to negotiate a peace deal. And just one small thing, it's going to be interesting to see now how the United Nations General Assembly is going to move forward with this, because I think we had a podcast a few weeks ago actually, when we spoke about a piece that was written by Olmert, the former prime minister, and he was discussing his fears that there's a very legitimate concern that he has, because of the conversations he's had with top officials, that there's going to be a resolution at the United Nations General Assembly to basically unilaterally recognize Palestine as a state, which will then go to the United Nations Security Council. And he was stating how this basically threatens Israel's leveraging power at the negotiating table, but now there's not even a negotiating table, and what this means for Israel. And it sort of looks at this point that that's what's going to happen, because the decisions that went through yesterday at the court are going to be forwarded to the United Nations General Assembly, who requested this ruling, and they're going to act accordingly. And it's going to be very interesting to see.
Right. And we're going to link that episode in the description. That's what we're referring to is the episode we did on Israeli Independence Day / Nakba Day, called The New Israeli Civil War Part 2. And that's a great segue. And like, now the Oslo Accords are no longer applicable in the way they were. And so that kind of is causing a little bit of a panic within the Israeli legal system. So referencing, and this is our last point about this, the press statement by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, is that they have desperately said again and again and again that this is not legally binding. Legally binding? No, it's not. But it does set a very, very, very clear tone, which will be referred to for years to come. And it has absolutely nothing good to say. You know, also, it finally went into the reparation question, which we'll get into in a second, which nobody that I've talked to expected it to be this clear this early that reparations are owed to the Palestinians. And this really shows that they mean business. So the
Mhm.
now that the tone is established for this going forward. Israel's going to be on the back foot no matter what. I don't know how they reclaim their narrative, or how they reclaim their status now that this precedent, this opinion, again, non-binding, fine. Even if it was binding, there's no mechanism of enforcement that would actually work right now to do it. But yes, the tone is set, and there's no way they can escape that going forward. And when we talk about like the rules-based order like blowing up, this is kind of um, this puts the Western powers that have historically always supported Israel into a very difficult position, because it's non-binding right now. Then it's going to go into, then it's going to develop after it gets sent to the UN General Assembly, and then it looks like something's going to be passed where some actual movement on this issue needs to be made. Israel may not comply. How is this enforced? Is it going to be enforced? And then the domino effect of the whole rules-based order that we're supposed to uphold is going to start to crumble in real time.
Exactly, because as we said, so if the United Nations General Assembly, for example, uses this ruling, because in a way as well, this ruling, by classifying that this is illegal occupation of Palestine, this is the ICJ, the Court of the United Nations, recognizing that Palestinians and Palestine exist, and it is a state that is illegally essentially occupied, that is seeking for its liberation, and it's advocating for that said liberation. So if the United Nations General Assembly passes a resolution where they're unilaterally essentially recognizing Palestinian statehood, and then this is basically forwarded to the United Nations Security Council, we could of course expect that the United States, maybe even the UK, are going to veto something like this. Several things are going to happen here. So on the one hand, you have the entire Western elite who are consistently advocating and trying to dictate to the world the significance of the rules-based order and how we must uphold Western democratic values. And we even saw recently, I don't know if you're following the parliamentary elections that took place here in the in the EU, and Ursula von der Leyen, basically she was voted as European Commission president again. I call her the Hillary Clinton of Europe, because that's basically the only way that that's the way I view her. She was revoted now as the president of the European Commission, and she went on a speech where she seemed, where she's emphatically sort of discussing, how we must support Ukraine because we must sustain the rules-based order. But then simultaneously, this same woman is in Israel stating that Israel has a right to defend itself, which we now know for a fact, based on the ICJ ruling, that it does not. And this is not the first time that the ICJ has ruled that Israel does not have a right to defend itself against the territories it is occupying, because we have another ruling as such in 2004 when Israel basically argued that they have a right to build walls in order to defend themselves within the occupied West Bank. And obviously the ICJ had effectively said that you cannot defend yourself against the population that you're occupying. So we already had that ruling, but now it's become even much more nuanced in its application. In the same way, you have Keir Starmer of the UK. You have the United States officials who are going to be aiding and abetting Israel, who is now essentially being told that they're illegally occupying territory, they're establishing an apartheid system, and then refusing to abide by the ICJ rulings and vetoing decisions at the United Nations Security Council. This is really going to illuminate even further the fact that the rules-based order in the United Nations and its institutions have merely been established for US hegemony and have established a system of legal and administrative control of other states, acting as a neo-colonialist entity for the purpose of suppressing others, whilst at the same time providing political impunity for themselves. And this will completely dismantle the Western institutions. And this is only going to aggravate other states, particularly in the global South, to move away from the West, and it's going to diminish their power. So if they continue playing this game, essentially, of we will support Israel no matter what. It's only going to be at their own detriment. And of course, I just want to mention here one last thing. We cannot forget the fact that in the United States, the notorious legislation, I've mentioned it before, Public Law 101246, Section 414, which basically is codified that if the United Nations ever gives any sort of recognition to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or basically any authority that is representative of the Palestinian people, or anything that basically favors the Palestinian people, they will stop funding to the United Nations. So again, they've codified in their own system a direct attack to the United Nations linked to Israel. And at this point, we're at a crucial point where they have set themselves up in a trap, and it could really be self-destructive.
Well, no, I mean, it really will be. And first, we can kind of predict how this will go, right? They're going to reduce, in terms of the public narrative, they're going to reduce the enormity of this opinion by the World Court to it's non-binding. It's like, okay, fine, it's non-binding. Then it's going to go to the General Assembly, gets pushed up to the Security Council. I'm assuming, since the main thrust is for like a Palestinian statehood to be recognized. That's where the global trend is going. It's going to go to the Security Council. Russia is going to vote yes. China is going to vote yes. Everyone else is going to vote yes, except what? The United States. I mean, what? The one way they can get out of it is abstaining. But I don't know. Like, if we were going to make predictions, like, what would that even look like?
Well, if they abstained, I mean, if we really got to that point where the United States actually abstained, that means that the vote would go through, which means we would have a binding solution that establishes Palestine as a state. And this means that Israel will definitely be coerced at this point to remove itself from the territories it gained in 1967. And it would coerce Israel to really actually get to the negotiating table, not to negotiate the end of the occupation, but sort of the details of how the occupation will end, territories to be exchanged, how the settlers are going to move. But at this point now as well, and I want to say one thing: if we go back to the decision, to the deal that was offered in 2000 by Bill Clinton. At the time, the Palestinians had even accepted that the settlers would stay in the areas that they are settling in the West Bank. And in exchange, Israel would give a small portion of land, although that was never defined as to how big that portion of land would be, back to the Palestinians to establish their state, whilst they basically take a chunk of the West Bank. Now, with this ICJ ruling, this is no longer something that's acceptable. The ICJ has effectively said all settlers need to leave. So even at the negotiating table, if, for example, the United States abstains, they will not be able anymore to have the kind of negotiating leverage that they once had. It will just be the end. So no more settlers staying in the West Bank, no more possibilities that they're going to the next part of the territory, because like we've said before, part of the reason, obviously, when you talk about settler colonialism, one of the reasons that they've been using these hundreds of thousands of settlers into the West Bank is for the very purpose that if one day there needs to be a negotiated deal, they're going to use those settlers to take as much territory from the Palestinians as possible, leaving essentially virtually nothing for Palestinian states to even exist. And so now that plan has also backfired. This is why this ruling is actually very important. And it also provides the way for other states now to sanction Israel, or even corporations to sanction Israel or to not work with Israel because of the illegality of its state. I mean, the fact that, it's now been officially recognized as a apartheid state, is going to be very hard for the so-called leaders of the free world to argue engaging international commerce with a state that has been found to be sustaining an apartheid system, at the very least. Especially, within liberal politics that are always advocating for, rights of minorities and etc., to now have a state that is essentially a racist state. It's essentially officially viewed as a state that discriminates based on race and religion. It's highly going to be very interesting to observe how the West will handle this.
Well, yeah, I mean, regardless, it's going to be a mess. I do think Israel will come to a place in the not too distant future. It will have to start halting expansion and then eventually returning land. Now, we have talked about how this could blow up in a number of different ways, and the entire ideology and methodology behind the settlements in West Bank is intentional. It's called Israel's pastrami sandwich policy, because former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon said in 1973, quote, "We'll make a pastrami sandwich of them. We'll insert a strip of Jewish settlement in between Palestinians and another strip of Jewish settlement right across the West Bank, so that in 25 years' time, neither the UN nor the US, nobody will be able to tear it apart." 1973, way before October 7th or the first Intifada. Again, in 1998, shortly before being elected prime minister, Sharon wrote, quote, "Everyone has to move, run and grab as many hilltops as they can to enlarge the settlements, because everything we take now will stay ours. Everything we don't grab will go to them." And since that time, innumerable illegal Israeli settlements have fragmented the land of West Bank while creating a concentration camp of Palestinians in Gaza, and thus making the creation of a viable Palestinian state increasingly more difficult. Because honestly, as long as these apartheid pastrami sandwich settlements that are woven in between increasingly ghettoized Palestinian enclaves, there is no freedom of movement. There is no way a government can function. So if there's this mandate that Palestinian statehood must happen, the occupation must end, per force, these settlements have to go. And now, we've talked about what will happen if that actually happens. And I think it's going to be messy. It's going to lead to civil strife, because they're used to acting with impunity, these radical settlers. And we do make a distinction between like what we would call liberal Tel Avivian Zionists who still support the occupation, but they're more secular, and they're not as radical as these these orthodox far right Judean settlers in the West Bank. And so there may be a real push to uphold international law, even if they hate it, from one side of the fence, and a complete rebellion against any enforcement of international law in the far right side of the bench. And it's going to get messy, because a lot of these military officers are from the far right. They have command. They have a lot of followers within the command, the military hierarchy, within the police, within Shin Bet, within the Mossad. So we can see this separation, this fragmentation happening once this becomes more of a reality for people. Because once the ICJ gave this ruling on Friday, there was massive settler violence blowing up. You could just search the internet and find it. Like, there was this massive outrage and rebellion against it. So what did they do? They went and burned down Palestinian homes, took sticks, beat any Palestinian they could find in the street. We've seen evidence. I didn't download any, so I can't show you, but it's readily available all across the internet. So there's a very visceral reaction to this ruling, and any enforcement of this is going to lead to violence.
And that's the thing. So many settlers as well are armed. Don't forget as well, Ben-Gvir armed, even settlers who are not even part of the military or anything like that. Any civilian settler civilian settler in the West Bank is armed with rifles. So I think he gets around like 250,000. That was at the beginning of October. At the beginning of the genocide, let's say. I mean, that those numbers have probably escalated since, but I haven't seen reports. So you got 250,000 from what we know, settlers with rifles who are incredibly extreme. And of course, like you said, it's not like the liberal Zionists who are much more circular, care for the Palestinians, but they are, I guess, more rational enough to understand that if they don't make some sort of concessions, that this will be catastrophic for their own Zionist state. So it comes from a position effectively of like, okay, if we're going to keep what we have and try to take as much as we can, given the circumstances, we're going to have to make certain concessions. But then you have the extreme Orthodox Jews who are not going to accept that, and you're going to see an inauguration of civil violence, which is going to turn into essentially a hot civil war in Israel. And I also think it's worth discussing because like the ICJ also ruled in its decision that it's issued a warning that no state should help Israel sustain its occupation and its apartheid system. And this is also going to be very, very important going forward, because you've got a lot of countries now, like whether it's South Africa. I mean, even this decision was made because 87 countries through the United Nations General Assembly were the ones that pushed for this trial to actually happen, to answer these fundamental questions. And obviously they have their reasons for doing so. Given this ruling, that means that action could actively be taken by other member states now against the US, against the UK, against Germany, and any country that will continue to facilitate Israel's occupation and Israel's apartheid system, whether it's financial aid or military support. This is all going to incriminate the Western states.
Yeah, it is. So they're going to eventually have to make a decision between their colony and the rules-based order, which allows them to project hegemony throughout the globe. And it's important to realize that, you know, whether it is economic, military aid, or like subsidizing healthcare or whatever, it all goes into this apartheid system. People accept apartheid in Israel in part because they have a comfortable life. They've got healthcare, they've got education, they've got housing. It's all very affordable. It's subsidized. They have their Israeli passports. They can go everywhere for now. The Maldives have already boycotted Israeli passports. Other countries are going to follow suit. They're eventually going to be boycotted from the Olympics, like South Africa was. It's going to, of all these liberal Zionists in Tel Aviv, it's going to start affecting their jet setter lifestyle. So you have the economic aspect and the social aspect of maintaining apartheid. People will become less accepting of the apartheid system once their life starts to become less comfortable. That and apartheid and occupation, it's expensive, y'all. It's expensive to have all that security equipment, set up all this equipment, have all these soldiers run the checkpoints day in, day out, processing soldiers in, processing soldiers out, taking them out of the workforce and paying for their reserve duty when they get called up to respond to an action. And that's not even getting into military funding. It's just expensive. And the Israeli economy cannot support a war of attrition. And they've got like 2 fronts going on right now, at least. And guess what? Their biggest local GDP producer, the high-tech sector, it is losing investment. Investment is fleeing the country in that respect. Then you've got more of the grassroots economy. 40 to 46,000 small businesses have gone out. Like, it's just not sustainable. So they can rail against this ruling at the ICJ, but that's not the only factor. It's like, it's non-binding. How are you going to enforce it? Well, it's like, that's not the only factor at play here when we talk about this. I just wanted to bring up the economic aspect of maintaining the system now that everybody sees what it is. And people have already started to withdraw their support, even in the West, whether it's like ending contracts with, defense contractors that are from Israel or support the occupation, sending weapons. I think it was the Netherlands that has halted weapons shipments. So even before this ruling has happened, now this is just another stone in the avalanche that's going to start falling. And of course, it's going to take time. But this ruling, because the Israeli Foreign Ministry would like you to just focus on their response to what this ruling is. It's non-binding. But there are so many other factors at play, too, that we have to acknowledge when we look at this picture as a whole.
Exactly. It doesn't matter whether it's non-binding or not. It has political repercussions. It will have economic repercussions. And it also will help shape the conversation that is being had globally. I mean, whether it's discussing, I can't stand the guy, but, people going on Piers Morgan and he's having a conversation with all these people he's discussing things with, this is really going to help put pressure now, even on mainstream media, the way that they are representing and discussing the context of the war, the context of October 7th, the occupation, Palestinians' rights, and it legitimizes and validates a lot of the arguments now that the Palestinians have been making for a very long time, and those that have been advocating for Palestinian statehood for a very long time. And so it's going to generate a sort of verifiable as well, retaliation, and it's going to coerce the states of the West, but also their mechanisms of, I call them mechanisms of control, their legislative mechanisms, their media mechanisms, etc., to have to reshape the argument themselves, because now they've basically been put in the spotlight to have to do so. And the old arguments that they were able to use to evade sort of addressing certain issues. So, for example, the whole narrative that Gaza is not occupied because there was military withdrawal in 2005, and because the ICJ, for example, hadn't said specifically whether Gaza is occupied or not, there wasn't actually any official ruling. They were able to play with that trope, but now it's been officialized, and this is the highest court of order. Unless they're going to start backing that even the United Nations and everything is anti-Semitic, then they're basically delegitimizing its own institutions. And so I don't see them doing that. And this is what's going to really change things in the long run. Israel will no longer have the defense it once had. It's going to put a lot of pressure on them politically. And that's going to come from the public as well, globally, who's going to put pressure on their governments, given this ICJ ruling. And we're going to start seeing, even from the angle of conscious consumerism, right? A lot of corporations are going to start withdrawing from working with Israeli companies, even if it means preserving their own image, and they're obviously, from a business model perspective, preserving their own financial interests. Because until October 7th, what the occupation and the apartheid was very financially beneficial. I mean, you had all these defense and surveillance and security industry was massive in Israel, and all these huge surveillance and tech industries were basically using the Palestinians, and we know this for a matter of fact now, as guinea pigs to exercise to practice their surveillance systems as well as their new military equipment. So this was a very highly profitable colony that they had in place, but now that's been completely dismantled. It no longer is going to be financially beneficial, and it's going to apply a lot of economic and political pressure on Israel. So no matter how much they say that this is non-binding, it's not. It's going to have long-term repercussions, and I do believe that we're going to see the impacts of the ICJ rulings much sooner than I think we anticipate. That's my personal belief.
Right, and I completely agree with you. Again, it will move slowly, and in the meantime, this ruling will not affect the lived experience of Palestinians in the short term. However, before we end, we've got a few more minutes left. We do have to acknowledge that we are coming from a place of rationality, and the Israeli government is not a rational actor. And now we're going to be dealing with someone else who is not a rational actor. And I just want to show you this article in case you missed it. This is from yesterday, Friday. This is Donald Trump speaking at the RNC. Return hostages before I assume office or face severe consequences. Yeah. So I think a Trump presidency is inevitable. So we've got the rest of July, then we've got August, September, October, November. So if this isn't resolved in 3 months, how do you foresee a Trump presidency affecting what's going on with the World Court and all these international institutions? We know he's trying to pull out of NATO, and he seems like he's going to be pro-Israel. He was already pro-Israel, but now he's got that Sheldon Adelson money, the $100 million, which was reportedly given to him to fund his campaign in return for him supporting West Bank settlement and occupation.
To be honest with you, you're okay. So, okay. Just to point out, there isn't going to be that much of a difference in terms of the United States foreign policy with Trump. I think he's just much more vocal. He's less diplomatic in the way he's going to express himself, but the agenda is still going to be the same. And like you said, we were coming from a position of from a rational perspective, but I do see that the United States is going to push back on the ICJ ruling, whether it's under a Democrat leadership or whether it's under Trump. They're not going to recognize it. It's not the first time as well. I mean, if we go back to the 1986 ruling by the ICJ. In the Nicaragua case, the United States was actually supposed to pay reparations to the people of Nicaragua for the Nicaragua Contras, but they ignored that completely as well. So the United States has a history of ignoring rulings that don't favor itself. It's just that now it's really being brought to the forefront, and the hypocrisy of everything that's going on with Ukraine and Russia as well. And it's just really sort of bringing to question the totality of Western hegemony and the United Nations institutions, which have become delegitimized. So I think that Trump is really going to just basically go full force ahead of ignoring the ICJ ruling and probably providing support to Israel, but that will be at the detriment of the United States. It will be at the detriment of the United Nations, and it will be at the detriment of these Western institutions in the long run. And even with regards to some of the statements he's made now with Iran, I mean, it really just speaks volumes as to what kind of presidency he's going to have, which again isn't going to be different to Biden. I mean, I don't think he's going to pull out of NATO, by the way. I just think he's using his NATO rhetoric because he understands. He's not an idiot. He understands that NATO is, as we've discussed before, NATO is a political and military alliance that uses its this allegiance to impose American foreign policy objectives to sustain its hegemony. He knows that. He's not going to withdraw. He's basically using this, I'm going to withdraw, as a sort of political leverage to coerce other member states to basically pay their due, supposedly their due. But he's not going to withdraw, from NATO. NATO will still live long and thrive. But to be honest, with regards to Palestine, or Israel specifically, I don't see much of a policy shift instantly, at least from the United States, unless they receive international pressure from abroad. And then it's going to, again, it will be interesting to see how that's going to play out. Whether it's Biden, whether it's Trump, or actually Biden is probably not going to be runner-up anymore. We'll see who's going to be going for the Democrats. But I personally think the United States is just going to continue shooting itself in the foot. That's my personal opinion. Yes. I think the United States is just going to go down that path of self-destruction. Yeah, but I just don't know what this means for the Palestinian people.
Yeah,
in the short term.
I mean, in the short term, it really doesn't mean anything. In the short term, there's so much inertia behind all this that nothing's really substantially going to change. But I think this is just another instance that kind of foreshadows the inevitable trajectory, which is the rules-based order just imploding, or how it's established now.
The only thing I can think about is if I was to combine this as well with what's happening with the axis of resistance. I mean, just to touch on it briefly, obviously we saw Yemen yesterday was successful in striking inside Tel Aviv. And now they've, Ansar Allah have basically stated that Tel Aviv is no longer a safe zone. I don't know to what extent they're going to continue and what kind of strategy they're going to have. But this could also apply a lot of pressure on Israel, in addition to obviously the ICJ. And obviously the fact that Israel is the United States itself lacks the capabilities to be able to sustain another major war in the Middle East if things escalate even further, because I'm seeing that the Axis is actively trying to now up the level in order to put even more pressure on Israel, economically, politically, and obviously militarily. This might coerce the United States, who has also, Trump is very fixated on Iran and China. We have to bear that in mind. His number one priority is China. He's not going to buckle down completely on Israel. And because Israel is itself in such a dire situation, and then combining that with everything that we're seeing with the access, we could actually maybe see, in combination with the ICJ ruling, some sort of, I don't like to say negotiated end to this, but we could see some sort of negotiated end to this. But again, this is just purely speculative at this point.
Yeah, this is all very speculative. I just wanted to do this episode to focus on like the actual, the real aspects of this world court opinion, because we're not going to see it in the mainstream media, and of course there's a lot of complicated dynamics and movement going on around this issue. I think the main thing we wanted to focus on with this one was just, what does the ruling mean in terms of international law, and how will this apply even more pressure to Israel going forward to end the occupation? So I think we did that. We also brought in like a lot of other stuff, but that's just the nature of geopolitics.
But you have to contextualize. You have to
Yeah.
It's hard not to contextualize, you know, especially this is such a complex. There's so many things going on with regards to this right now. And like, you know, like you said, the Western mainstream media is just going to oversimplify it to like, yeah, they said this, it's non-binding. The United States probably spokesperson, Matt Miller, just going to turn around and say, yeah, well, they said that, but, you know, agree with that decision. And it's not going to really, the validity of it is not going to be highlighted. So I think it's important to highlight it. Like I said, I'm curious to see what the United Nations General Assembly is what kind of resolutions they're going to try and pass through. And also the presidency now for the the United Nations Security Council is Russia. So that's going to be interesting to see what kind of resolutions are going to pass into the United Nations Security Council, because they obviously, the presidency also decides what kind of resolutions are going to get voted on. So it's going to be interesting to see how this month is going to flow following the ICJ ruling through these institutions.
That's right. So it's going to be an interesting month. And just a reminder, before we end, Benjamin Netanyahu is still coming to speak to Congress on the 24th in Washington, D.C. He hasn't canceled as of yet, and it's still being reported that he is flying into Congress to speak to our legislature with hostage families. So the action is still on. I'll be there, and we're going to try and get stuck in. So that's where we're going to leave it. Just we're applying pressure where we can to end the madness. This has been our discussion and contextualization of the World Bank's opinion released this past Friday, July 19th, on Israel's apartheid and occupation. And we didn't get to touch on the reparations aspect, which no one expected to really happen. But we can do that at another time. There's going to be a lot more developments on that coming forward. So thank you all for listening. We'll see you next time. Like, share, and subscribe if you want to. We're also on Patreon. I'm going to be talking about this Iran narrative, the assassination of President Trump later today. So cheers, y'all, and we'll see you next week.